Welcome to this episode of UXD, where we're going to learn more about Lean UX and why it's important in creating products that people love. I'm your host, Nazmul Idris. I have a very special guest with me today, Laura Klein, author of UX for Lean Startups. Welcome to the show.
Hello, internets.
Before we start talking about Lean UX, we should perhaps address Lean Startup first. So Laura, what is Lean Startup?
So Lean Startup is a methodology that was created by Eric Ries, and it's based on lean manufacturing, which actually came out of Toyota. Lean Startup is about learning as quickly as possible and reducing the cycle time through what's called the build, measure, learn loop. The idea is that instead of just assuming that you know exactly what you should build, you form a hypothesis that something might work, and then you find the fastest way to validate or invalidate that hypothesis.
That makes sense.
The goal, of course, is to create things that people want to use and that they will actually buy. And we do that by learning and validating our ideas at every step of the way.
That makes sense. So, Laura, word on the street is that I can make some products very quickly and on the cheap without spending any money on design using this Lean Startup thing. Is that true?
No,
Oh,
it is
I didn't think
not
it
true.
was.
I know, it's terrible that it isn't. But
I
it's
know.
absolutely not true. Because Lean Startup really, it's not about being cheap and it's not about being free or cutting corners. And just because you're bootstrapping your startup doesn't make you lean. Okay, so it turns out that lean startups can end up spending less money and time than other startups, but that's because they're constantly evaluating whether they're building the right thing, and that minimizes waste. Just saving money or going fast does not make you lean.
That makes sense. So, what is Lean UX and how is it different than Lean Startup?
Lean UX is really just a way to apply those iterative methods to the user experience design practice. Doing Lean UX means that you're always validating with users that you're designing something that people are going to use. It's about designing products that are both usable and useful.
That makes sense. So, you wrote a book about this, right? So, what type of an audience would find this book useful?
So, right, the book is called UX for Lean Startups, but it's not actually just for UX designers, and it's not even really just for startups. So, I don't know, maybe I could have named it better, but the book is really for anybody who's building a product, because design is everybody's job. It gives you a lot of tips and tools for learning from your users and turning that understanding into great products that people will actually buy.
That makes sense. Design is everyone's responsibility. We say that a lot on the show. So, Laura, if I want a Lean UX organization in my company, how do I go about and make that happen?
Well, if you're at a big company with a lot of siloed organizations, UX in one silo, engineering in another, marketing in another, it can be a really big change. But even if you're a startup with, one designer and 3 people in a room, there are still some fundamental things that you need to get right. The ones that I think are most important are thinking in terms of hypotheses and assumptions and learning to validate those before you commit to building. Creating cross-functional teams that include engineering, design, research, product management, and whoever else needs to be involved in these product decisions. You need an environment where you can measure and test all of your design and product decisions, and a team that's open to understanding the real impact that they're having on end users. You also need a really different approach to design deliverables, where you're only creating artifacts that are necessary for communication. You're not making little pixel perfect mock-ups for every single change. And finally, you need support from the top of your organization, because you're going to have to change your whole way of thinking about products. You need product managers and designers to be held accountable for the impact that their decisions have on the end user.
That makes sense.
You no longer get evaluated on whether a feature ships or not. You get evaluated based on whether the changes you make positively impact user behavior. And that's a big change that needs to happen at the very top of the organization.
That is so true. So Laura, can you talk more about validating assumptions and hypotheses? That sounds really important, but it also sounds complicated. What does it mean exactly?
So it's a really big part of Lean UX, and it's a big change in the way we work. We have to stop assuming that we know exactly what we're building. Instead, we need to frame everything as a hypothesis that is going to be validated before we commit those coding resources.
So can you explain that with an example?
I can. So here's something that I think a lot of us can probably identify with. I want you to imagine that you've got a product and your product manager comes in and says, our product needs more social. Make it more social. Let's add comments.
Isn't everything better with social?
Everything is better with social. But see, what happens is that the product manager, comes up with this brilliant, brand new idea for comments. And then the designers immediately dive in and they start thinking, okay, how do I make the ideal comments experience? And then the engineers go, okay, great. How do I write this code so that it's a really fast, stable comments experience? But instead, what we should be asking is, how do we know whether this is even the right thing to build in the first place?
That makes sense.
See, the whole comments feature has a lot of assumptions packed into it. For example, there's this assumption that by making the product more social, our key metrics are going to improve. Do we really know that? Do we know that adding a comments feature is going to improve our business? Do we even know that people are going to leave comments? In other words, do comments fulfill either a user need or a business need, or even better, both? We can't just, assume that those things are true because the product manager had an idea. Instead of assuming that those are facts, we're going to treat them as hypotheses and we're going to test them as quickly as possible. And ideally, we're going to test them without building the entire comments feature and then launching it and just seeing how it does.
That makes sense. So if these are hypotheses, how do we validate them?
So this is where we run into a really common lean startup buzzword, MVP.
I've heard of that.
Yeah, we need to build an MVP. And an MVP is a minimum viable product. It's the smallest possible thing that we can build that will help us to learn whether or not our hypothesis is true.
That makes sense. I've heard of these MVPs. So aren't they just really crappy versions of products?
They are not.
Ah.
So this is a common misconception. But an MVP is never, a crappy version of a product. Because it turns out that the only thing that we learn from crappy products is that people don't like crappy products. That's a well-validated hypothesis. We know that people hate crappy things. The word viable is actually there for a reason. It's got to be something that we can learn from.
Well, that makes sense. So what is the MVP version of this comments feature?
That's a good question. There are actually a few different versions of the MVP, and you could start with any of them, sort of depending on what you want to validate first. So for example, if you wanted to validate whether anybody would leave a comment at all, you might create what we call a fake door or a feature stub.
What is a fake door?
So if you want to validate whether anybody's going to use something, you build the very first interaction with that feature, and then you record whether anybody interacts with it. So in this case, you might put a box on the page that's a little comment box, and it's got a little button that says add a comment, and you let people add a comment, but instead of adding the comment to the page immediately, you might just give the answer a nice thank you message saying you're reviewing the comment, and then you'd send the comment in an email to you. That way you'd know whether anybody tried to leave one. It's a lot faster than building the whole system, with flagging and blocking and moderation and everything, and then, realizing that nobody has anything to say.
Well, that makes sense. So that's a quick way to validate. Now, what if people actually start leaving comments, like they actually engage with this feature?
Yeah, so once you validated that people are interested in starting this process and leaving comments, the next minimum viable product might be to see whether adding some of those products to the page actually makes a difference in your metrics.
Ah.
So remember, you've got some comments that people have emailed to you. And so you could add those to the page by hand and then do an A/B test to see if the comments you've added make a difference. For example, show the same page with comments and without and see if more people buy on the page that has comments.
That makes sense. So what you're saying is that the idea of an MVP is to learn whether a feature or product is likely to succeed before you actually put in the resource to completely build it.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That's 100% true. And that's really what this whole thing is about.
That makes sense. So now, after the MVP, how do you know when your hypotheses and assumptions have been validated?
That's an excellent question, and it's also a huge question with a lot of answers to it. The basic idea is that you have to be able to measure your results in some way. And if you can't tell what effect your changes are having on real user behavior, you can't actually ever know whether your design decisions were any good.
That makes sense. So can you illustrate that with an example?
Sure. So let's say you end up shipping that comments feature that we've been talking about. In most places, you just ship the feature and then move on to the next one. But what if for some reason that you don't necessarily understand, when this feature is out in the wild, comments really end up hurting your product?
Uh-oh.
Yeah, I know. So, maybe, this sounds weird, but maybe people are so busy commenting on things that they don't buy anything. Or, maybe comments make the page load really slow,
right,
and you end up driving people away. There could be any number of reasons that a feature might fail. But the point is that you don't know it fails unless you're measuring.
That makes sense. So is this where you might use A/B testing?
A/B testing is really the best way to test the real impact that your changes have on your product. But there are other ways, both qualitative and quantitative, to validate your changes.
Ah, that sounds like something we should talk about in future episodes.
I think you're right.
Cool. Well, thank you so much for being on the show. If you want to learn more about Lean UX before we make more episodes on it, don't forget to read Laura's book, UX for Lean Startups, where she will teach you all about making products that people love.
Thanks, everybody. Go and build something amazing.
And thank you, Laura, again for being here. And thank you for watching. Goodbye.